Our next learning objective is to compute the cost per equivalent unit using the weighted average method. Our cost per equivalent unit will simply be our total cost for the period divided by the equivalent units of production for the period. The first step then is to accumulate our cost, and our cost can consist of beginning work in process, direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Once we've accumulated our cost for the period, we'll simply divide it by the equivalent units of production for the period, and that will give us our cost per equivalent unit. The one twist is we might want to break our total cost, that is what we have in work in process, down into various categories. We might want to calculate an average cost per equivalent unit for direct materials, one for direct labor, and also one for manufacturing overhead. In the example that we walk through now, we're going to look at our average cost per equivalent unit for direct materials, and then we're going to have direct labor and overhead combined into conversion costs. Superior Microproducts uses the weighted average method in its process costing system. Data for the assembly department for May appear below. Let's compute the cost per equivalent unit for direct materials, for labor, and for overhead, and our total cost per equivalent whole unit. First, we're given our beginning cost in work in process for materials, labor, and overhead. Next, we want to add to that the costs that were added during the period, which again we are given as $238,900 for materials, $80,300 for labor, and $401,500 for overhead. We then need to calculate or sum these together to get the total cost for our direct materials, which will be $256,900, the total cost for direct labor, which will be $85,800, and the total cost for manufacturing overhead, which is $429,000. The next step is to calculate our cost per equivalent unit is to take our cost and divide it by our equivalent units. We're given our equivalent units in the data for our problem. We had equivalent units of production for materials, 35,000, 33,000 equivalent units for labor, and 33,000 equivalent units for overhead. The final step then is to take our cost for direct materials of $256,900 and divide it by the 35,000 equivalent units, and we get a cost per equivalent unit of $7.34 for direct materials. For direct labor, we get a cost per equivalent unit of $2.60 per unit. And for manufacturing overhead, when we take the $429,000 and divide it by 33,000 equivalent units, we get a cost of $13 per equivalent unit. Our total cost per equivalent unit would be the sum of our direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, and it would be $22.94.